The December air in suburban Chicago bit through Richard's wool coat as he stood on the familiar doorstep of 1247 Maple Drive. At 65, his weathered hands trembled slightly, not from the cold, but from the anticipation of seeing his family after 18 months of carefully maintained distance. The house looked exactly as he remembered. The same red brick facade, the same white shutters that Sarah had insisted on painting herself 20 years ago, and now the same Christmas lights twinkling in patterns his daughter-in-law probably spent hours perfecting. He adjusted his tie, navy blue with small silver dots, the one his late wife Margaret had bought him for their 40th anniversary. It felt appropriate somehow, carrying a piece of her to this reunion. The leather briefcase in his left hand contained carefully wrapped presents for his 3 grandchildren, each one selected after weeks of consideration. At his age, Richard had learned that time was the most precious gift, but he hoped the tangible ones would at least open doors to conversation. The doorbell's familiar chime echoed inside, followed by the sound of running feet and muffled voices. Richard's heart rate quickened as he heard his son David's voice approaching. "I'll get it, honey." "It's probably the delivery guy with—" The door swung open, and David's expression shifted from casual expectation to something Richard couldn't quite read. Surprise? Irritation? After 38 years of being this man's father, Richard realized with a sinking feeling that he couldn't interpret his own son's emotions anymore. "Dad?" David stood in the doorway, his 6-foot frame filling the space. He'd put on weight since Richard had last seen him. Stress weight, probably. The accounting firm David ran with 2 partners had been struggling, according to the brief updates Richard received through his daughter Lisa. "What are you—" "I mean, we weren't expecting—" "I know I should have called." Richard's voice carried the slight rasp of age, and too many years of cigars he'd finally quit. "But it's Christmas Eve, son. I thought—" He paused, searching for words that wouldn't sound like an accusation. "I thought it might be nice to surprise everyone." David's wife Michelle appeared behind him, wiping her hands on a dish towel decorated with reindeer. She'd always been kind to Richard, even during the worst of the family tensions. Her smile seemed genuine, though he caught the quick glance she shot at her husband. "Richard, come in, it's freezing out there." Michelle stepped around David, who seemed rooted in place. "The kids are in the living room. They'll be so excited to see Grandpa." But David didn't move aside immediately. Instead, he looked directly at his father with eyes that held 2 decades of accumulated grievances and asked the question that would change everything. "Why are you even here?" The words hung in the December air like frozen breath. Richard felt something crack inside his chest, not his heart exactly, but something deeper. The careful architecture of hope he'd built for this reunion crumbled in an instant. Michelle gasped audibly. "David!" But Richard was already processing the tone, the genuine confusion in his son's voice. This wasn't just surprise or even annoyance. This was a man who truly could not fathom why his 65-year-old father would want to spend Christmas with his family. Richard started, then stopped. Then, "What was the answer? Because I'm your father? Because I miss you? Because I'm getting older and realized I might not have many more Christmases? Because your mother would have wanted this?" Instead, he simply said, "I brought presents for the children." David finally stepped aside, but the gesture felt mechanical rather than welcoming. The warm air from inside hit Richard's face, carrying scents of cinnamon and roasting turkey, sounds of laughter from deeper in the house. His grandchildren, Emma 12, Jake 10, and little Sophie 7, voices mixing with Christmas music playing softly in the background. "Grandpa Richard!" Sophie's voice cut through the tension as she appeared around the corner, her blonde curls bouncing as she ran toward him. At 7, she was still young enough to show unfiltered joy, and Richard felt his first genuine smile of the day as he knelt to catch her enthusiastic hug. "There's my little angel," he whispered into her hair, which smelled like Johnson's baby shampoo. "Have you been good for Santa?" "I've been really, really good," Sophie announced solemnly. "I helped Mommy make cookies, and I didn't even eat the dough when she wasn't looking. Well, maybe just a little bit." Emma and Jake appeared more cautiously. At 12, Emma was beginning to sense adult tensions, and her greeting was more reserved. Jake, caught between childhood and adolescence, gave his grandfather a quick hug before stepping back to gauge his father's reaction. Richard distributed the presents he'd brought, watching as the children's excitement began to thaw the frozen atmosphere. But he remained acutely aware of David standing near the doorway, checking his phone with the kind of distracted attention that suggested he was looking for an escape route from his own living room. The next hour passed in carefully managed politeness. Richard helped set the table, complimented Michelle's cooking, and asked appropriate questions about the children's school activities. But David's question echoed in his mind with each passing minute. "Why are you even here?" As they sat down for dinner, Richard realized he was seeing his family as if through glass, present but separate, included but not belonging. The conversation flowed around him. David discussing a difficult client, Michelle sharing neighborhood gossip, the children arguing about whether Die Hard counted as a Christmas movie. "So, Dad," David said during a lull, his tone carrying forced casualness, "how long are you planning to stay?" Richard had hoped to stay through New Year's, maybe longer if things went well. He'd even brought extra clothes, thinking optimistically about extended visits, morning coffee conversations, maybe helping with homework or bedtime stories. "I was hoping we could spend some real time together," Richard said carefully. "I know I haven't been around as much as I should have been." David's laugh was sharp and humorless. "As much as you should have been?" "Dad, you missed Jake's birthday. Again, you missed Emma's piano recital. You missed Sophie's first day of school." "I sent gifts," Richard protested, knowing how weak it sounded. "Gifts." David set down his fork with deliberate precision. "You think gifts make up for not being here?" Michelle placed a warning hand on her husband's arm. "David, please, it's Christmas." But the floodgates were open now. Richard watched his son transform from the polite but distant host into something rawer, more honest, and infinitely more painful to witness. "No, Michelle, I'm tired of pretending this is normal." David turned back to Richard. "You disappear for months at a time. You move to Florida without discussing it with anyone. You sell the house Mom loved without asking if we wanted anything from it. And then you show up on Christmas Eve with presents and expect us to what? Be grateful?" Richard felt the familiar surge of his own anger, the reflexive defensiveness that had characterized too many of their interactions over the years. "I moved to Florida because I couldn't stand being in that house without your mother. Every room reminded me of her. I sold it because maintaining it was too much for a man my age living alone." "You could have moved closer to us," David shot back. "You could have been part of our lives instead of this stranger who sends birthday cards and shows up randomly expecting to be welcomed like nothing happened." The children had grown quiet, sensing the adult conflict that was spiraling beyond the usual family tensions. Sophie climbed down from her chair and moved to Richard's side, her small hand finding his. "Don't be mad at Grandpa," she whispered to her father. The innocence in her voice seemed to deflate some of David's anger, but not his frustration. He looked at his daughter, then at Richard, and Richard saw something in his son's eyes that was worse than anger, resignation. "I'm not mad, sweetheart," David said softly to Sophie. Then to Richard, "I'm just tired of being disappointed." The rest of the evening passed in strained politeness. Richard helped clear the dishes, played a half-hearted game of Monopoly with the grandchildren, and made appropriate comments about Michelle's excellent pie. but David's words had changed the fundamental chemistry of the gathering. At 10:30, as Richard prepared to leave for his hotel, David walked him to the door. The earlier anger had been replaced by something that felt like exhaustion. "Look, Dad," David said, his voice quiet enough that the children couldn't hear. "I appreciate you coming by, I really do, but I think maybe we need to have a real conversation about what this relationship actually is, because showing up once every year or two and expecting everything to be fine, it's not working." Richard nodded, though he felt like he was agreeing to his own execution. "Maybe you're right." As he drove back to the Holiday Inn Express on Route 59, Richard replayed the evening frame by frame. But it wasn't the argument that stayed with him. It was David's initial question, asked with such genuine bewilderment. "Why are you even here?" Back in his hotel room, Richard sat on the edge of the bed and opened his briefcase. Beneath the spare clothes and toiletries was a manila folder containing his updated will. He'd brought it intending to discuss his legacy with David, to explain his decisions and ensure his son understood the thought behind them. Now, staring at the document that left 70% of his considerable estate to David, Richard felt something shift inside him. Not anger exactly, but a cold clarity. If David truly couldn't understand why his father would want to be part of his family's Christmas, then perhaps David didn't deserve to benefit from a lifetime of his father's work and sacrifice. Richard pulled out his phone and called his attorney's emergency line. "Harold, it's Richard Thompson. I know it's late, but I need to make some changes to my will. Tonight." "You better say..." Harold Brennan had been Richard's attorney for 15 years, handling everything from Margaret's estate planning to Richard's business transitions. At 72, Harold understood that wealthy clients sometimes made emotional decisions at inconvenient hours, especially around holidays. What surprised him was Richard's tone, not angry or grief-stricken, but coldly decisive. "I can meet you at the office in 20 minutes, Harold said, his voice thick with sleep. "But Richard, are you sure this can't wait until after Christmas? Making major changes to estate planning during emotional moments isn't usually advisable." Richard was already putting on his coat. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." The law offices of Brennan, Mitchell and Associates occupied the top floor of a glass building in downtown Naperville. At nearly midnight on Christmas Eve, the parking lot was empty except for Richard's rented sedan and Harold's aging Mercedes. The security guard, a cheerful man named Miguel, who worked double shifts during the holidays, let them into the building with good-natured grumbling about lawyers who couldn't take vacations. Harold's office reflected 4 decades of legal practice. Leather-bound books, family photos, and the kind of solid oak furniture that suggested permanence and tradition. Richard had always found it comforting, but tonight, the familiar space felt like a courtroom where he was about to deliver a verdict. "Coffee?" Harold offered, moving to the small machine in the corner. "No, I want to be clear-headed for this." Harold settled behind his desk and opened Richard's file. "All right. What exactly do you want to change?" "I want David removed as primary beneficiary, completely." Harold's pen stopped moving. In 15 years of practice, he'd seen clients angry at their children, but complete disinheritance was rare, and usually involved more dramatic circumstances than family arguments. "Richard, that's a significant change. David currently inherits 70% of your estate, including the Florida properties, the investment accounts, and the Chicago commercial real estate. We're talking about roughly $12 million. "I'm aware of what I'm giving up," Richard said, "or rather, what I'm taking back." Harold leaned forward, switching from legal technician to family counselor, a role he'd played countless times over the years. "Can you tell me what happened tonight?" Richard recounted the evening's events with the precision of a man accustomed to business presentations. Harold listened without interruption, occasionally making notes, his expression growing more concerned as the story progressed. So your son asked why you were there, and you interpreted this as complete rejection. It wasn't the question, Harold. It was how he asked it, like my presence was genuinely incomprehensible to him. Richard's voice remained steady, but Harold caught the underlying pain. And then he proceeded to list every way I've failed as a father and grandfather. From what you've told me, you missed some important events. That's painful for children, even adult children. I missed events because I was building the business that will provide for their future. I missed events because after Margaret died, I could barely function, let alone play the role of devoted grandfather. Richard's composure cracked slightly. And I missed events because every time I tried to be involved, David made it clear I was an inconvenience. Harold had handled enough family disputes to recognize the circular nature of this conflict. Father and son locked in a pattern of mutual disappointment, each convinced the other was primarily to blame. Richard, let me ask you something. If you disinherit David, what do you hope to accomplish? The question hung in the air for several moments. Richard stared out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the empty streets below, Christmas lights twinkling in houses where families were presumably sleeping peacefully after successful holiday gatherings. I want him to understand that actions have consequences, Richard finally said. I want him to realize that treating family like an obligation rather than a blessing comes with a price. And if he never realizes that, if this just drives the wedge deeper, Richard turned back to Harold. Then at least I'll know I didn't reward him for treating me like a stranger. Harold opened his laptop and began pulling up the necessary documents. All right. Who do you want as the primary beneficiary instead? Lisa. Richard's daughter lived in Portland, managing a non-profit that provided housing for homeless veterans. She called him every Sunday, sent photos of her children regularly, and had visited him in Florida 3 times in the past year. 60% to Lisa. 20% divided equally among the grandchildren, to be held in trust until they're 25. 10% to various charities. David gets 10%, enough to know I didn't forget him, not enough to change his life. As Harold typed, he continued probing gently. Have you considered that David might be going through difficulties you're not aware of? Financial stress, marital problems, health issues. Sometimes people lash out when they're struggling. If he's struggling, he's never told me. We don't have that kind of relationship. And whose fault is that? The question stopped Richard cold. He'd been so focused on David's rejection that he hadn't considered his own role in the emotional distance between them. I don't know, Richard admitted. Maybe both of ours, but I'm the one who tried to bridge it tonight, and I'm the one who got my head handed to me for the effort. Harold finished the legal language and printed the documents. As Richard signed each page, Harold made one final attempt at intervention. Richard, this is legally binding the moment you sign it. But it's also reversible if you change your mind. Why don't you sleep on it? Give yourself a few days to process what happened tonight. Richard signed the final page with the Mont Blanc pen Margaret had given him for his 50th birthday. Harold, I'm 65 years old. I've buried my wife, built and sold 2 successful businesses, and raised 2 children. I think I'm capable of making a decision and living with the consequences. Harold notarized the documents and filed them in his secure cabinet. As they prepared to leave, he placed a hand on Richard's shoulder. For what it's worth, I think you're both hurt and you're both stubborn. That's a dangerous combination. Driving back to the hotel, Richard felt something he hadn't expected. Relief. For months, he'd been carrying the weight of trying to reconnect with David, the constant second-guessing of his approach, the rehearsal of conversations that never went as planned. Now, at least, he'd taken action. Whether it was the right action remained to be seen, but it was decisive. His phone buzzed with a text message. For a moment, hope flared. Maybe David had reflected on the evening and wanted to apologize, to start over. But the message was from Lisa. "Hope you had a wonderful Christmas Eve, Dad. The kids are so excited for tomorrow morning. Love you." Richard stared at the message, considering whether to tell Lisa about the evening's events and his legal response. But that conversation could wait. Tonight, he just needed to sit with his decision and prepare for whatever came next. Back in his hotel room, Richard poured himself a glass of the single malt scotch he'd brought as a gift for David, Macallan 18, David's favorite, though Richard wondered if his son even remembered telling him that during a rare moment of connection 5 years ago. As he sipped the whiskey, Richard thought about the last conversation he'd had with Margaret before her cancer took her. She'd been worried about the growing distance between Richard and David, the way work and grief and stubborn pride were building walls between the men she loved most. "Promise me you'll keep trying," she'd whispered, her hand surprisingly strong despite the medication and weakness. "Promise me you won't let pride destroy what's left of our family." Richard had promised, and he'd tried. But trying, apparently, wasn't enough. And maybe Margaret hadn't understood that sometimes love required tough choices, consequences, and the willingness to walk away from relationships that had become too painful to maintain. As he prepared for bed, Richard realized that for the first time in months, he wasn't dreading tomorrow. He'd made a choice, taken control of at least one aspect of his relationship with David. Whether that choice would ultimately heal or destroy what remained of their bond was yet to be determined. But tonight, at least, Richard Thompson slept soundly. 3 days after Christmas, Richard was back in his Fort Lauderdale condo, trying to establish normal routines, while his phone remained stubbornly silent. He'd half expected David to call, maybe not to apologize, but at least to continue their argument. The silence felt more definitive than anger would have. The condo overlooked the Intracoastal Waterway, and Richard had established a morning routine of coffee on the balcony while watching the early joggers and dog walkers navigate the palm-lined paths below. At 65, he'd learned to appreciate small pleasures: good coffee, Florida sunshine, the absence of Chicago winters. But this morning, even the familiar rituals felt hollow. His phone rang at 9:47 a.m. Lisa's name appeared on the screen, and Richard felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. "Dad!" Lisa's voice carried that particular tone adult children use when they're about to address family dysfunction. "I just got off the phone with David." Richard set down his coffee cup. "I see. He told me about Christmas Eve." A pause. "He also told me about some legal documents he found out about yesterday." Richard closed his eyes. Harold must have sent the customary notification to all family members about the will change, standard legal procedure. But Richard had hoped for more time before this conversation. "Lisa, Dad, did you really disinherit David because of one argument?" The disappointment in his daughter's voice cut deeper than David's rejection had. Lisa had always been his bridge to the family, the one who managed to love everyone without taking sides. Losing her support would leave him completely isolated. "It wasn't one argument, sweetheart. It was the culmination of years of being treated like an unwelcome stranger in my own son's life." "But disinheritance? Dad, that's nuclear. That's something you can't take back." "Actually, I can take it back, legally anyway." Lisa was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice was softer, more careful. "Tell me what really happened. Not the legal version, the dad version." So Richard told her everything. The months of planning for the visit, his hopes for reconciliation, David's casual cruelty, the feeling of being fundamentally unwanted by his own child. Lisa listened without interruption, and Richard found himself revealing emotions he'd barely acknowledged to himself. "I felt like a fool," he concluded, like a 65-year-old man begging for scraps of affection from someone who genuinely couldn't understand why I'd want to spend Christmas with my own family. Oh, Dad. Lisa's sigh carried across 1,000 miles. David's an idiot, but he's a scared idiot. Scared of what? Of being like you. The words hit Richard like a physical blow. What does that mean? Dad, you're brilliant. You built 2 successful companies from nothing. You provided for us beautifully, but you were never really present. Even when you were physically there, you were thinking about work, about deals, about the next project. Lisa's voice was gentle but unflinching. David's terrified of being that kind of father, so he overcompensates by being hyper-present with his kids, and when you show up, it feels like a criticism of the choices he's made. Richard had never considered this perspective. In his mind, David had simply rejected him. The idea that his son might be struggling with his own parental insecurities hadn't occurred to him. "But I changed after your mother got sick," Richard protested. "I retired early to spend time with her. I've been trying to be more involved with the grandchildren. I know, and I see that, but David remembers the dad who missed Little League games for client meetings, who took business calls during dinner, who was physically present but emotionally unavailable." Lisa paused. "And he remembers Mom covering for you, making excuses, handling everything so you could focus on building your empire." The accuracy of this assessment was painful. Margaret had indeed managed the emotional infrastructure of their family, while Richard managed the financial infrastructure. It had seemed like a reasonable division of labor at the time. "So, what do I do?" Richard asked. "Well, step 1 would be not disinheriting him. Lisa, you didn't see his face. You didn't hear how he asked why I was even there, like my presence was incomprehensible. And you didn't see his face when Harold's office called about the will change," Lisa countered. "Michelle said he locked himself in the garage for 2 hours. He's not indifferent, Dad. He's hurt." This was news to Richard. In his mental narrative, David was the rejecter, not the rejected. The idea that his son might be experiencing his own pain complicated the moral clarity Richard had felt since Christmas Eve. "Has he said anything about wanting to talk?" "He's too proud and too scared, just like you." Before Richard could respond, Lisa continued, "Dad, I need to tell you something else. The inheritance isn't really about the money, is it?" Richard considered lying, but Lisa had always been able to see through his evasions. "No. It's about acknowledgement, recognition that I matter, that I'm family, that 38 years of being his father counts for something. And what if disinheriting him just proves to him that you don't think he matters, that you're willing to write him off the moment he disappoints you?" The logic was uncomfortable but undeniable. Richard had acted to punish David for making him feel unwanted, but the punishment itself might confirm David's belief that his father's love was conditional on performance. "I don't know how to fix this," Richard admitted. "Start by understanding that you're both hurt and you're both wrong, and you're both too stubborn to admit it." Lisa's voice carried the exasperation of someone who'd been mediating family conflicts for decades. "David was cruel on Christmas Eve. But you've been emotionally absent for most of his life. You're both paying for choices you made years ago." After hanging up with Lisa, Richard spent the rest of the morning walking along Las Olas Beach, trying to process perspectives he'd never considered. The January tourists were out in force, pale Midwesterners like himself, fleeing winter for a few days of artificial summer. He envied their simple vacation problems. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown Chicago number. "Mr. Thompson, this is Michelle, David's wife. Could we talk? I think there are things you need to know." An hour later, Richard was sitting in his car outside a Starbucks, talking to his daughter-in-law on speakerphone. Michelle had always been diplomatically neutral in family conflicts, so her willingness to reach out suggested the situation was more serious than he'd realized. "Richard, I'm going to tell you some things David would kill me for sharing, but I think they're important." Michelle's voice was steady but tired. "David has been seeing a therapist for the past year. The main issue he's working on is his relationship with you." Richard felt his chest tighten. "What kind of therapy?" "Family systems therapy. Trying to understand patterns, break cycles, figure out how to be the father he wishes he'd had without resenting the father he did have." The irony was almost unbearable. While Richard had been planning his Christmas reconciliation, David had been in therapy, trying to process their relationship. "The night you came over," Michelle continued, "David had been planning to call you after the holidays. He wanted to suggest family counseling, maybe start over with professional help. When you showed up unexpectedly, it triggered all his anxiety about not being ready, not having the right words, not knowing how to navigate a conversation with you. So he lashed out instead. He panicked, and when David panics, he gets mean. It's his worst trait, and he knows it." Michelle paused. "Richard, he spent Christmas night crying in our bedroom, not angry crying, heartbroken crying. He kept saying he'd ruined everything, that he'd finally driven you away for good." This version of events was so different from Richard's experience that it felt like learning about a different family entirely. In his narrative, David was callously indifferent. In Michelle's version, David was struggling with decades of accumulated hurt and fear. "And then Harold's office called about the will change," Michelle continued. "David hasn't eaten since then. He's convinced this proves you never really loved him, that everything was conditional on his performance as the perfect son." Richard closed his eyes. "That's not... I didn't mean it that way. I know, but that's how it feels to him. And frankly, Richard, I can see why." The gentle reproof stung because it came from Michelle, who'd never criticized him before. "What do I do?" Richard asked. "Come back, not with presents or grand gestures or legal maneuvers. Just come back and sit in our living room and have the conversation you've both been avoiding for 20 years. What if he won't see me? He will. He's too curious not to. But Richard..." Michelle's voice grew firmer. "You have to be prepared to hear things that might be hard to accept. And you have to be prepared to apologize for more than just Christmas Eve." After ending the call, Richard sat in the Starbucks parking lot for another hour, watching families navigate the simple complexities of afternoon coffee runs. Children demanding cake pops, parents negotiating screen time, grandparents indulging everyone with patient smiles. Normal family friction, the kind that got resolved with hugs and forgotten by dinner time. He pulled out his phone and called Harold. "I want to discuss reversing the will change," Richard said without preamble. "Thank God," Harold replied. "When do you want to come in?" "I don't. Not yet. First, I need to go back to Chicago." Richard's return flight to Chicago was delayed 3 hours due to thunderstorms, giving him ample time to rehearse conversations that he knew would never go as planned. By the time he landed at O'Hare, it was nearly 10 p.m. on January 2nd, and he was operating on caffeine, anxiety, and a growing certainty that this trip would either repair his relationship with David or destroy it completely. He didn't call ahead. After Michelle's advice and Lisa's insights, Richard understood that his pattern of trying to control situations through advanced planning might be part of the problem. Sometimes he was learning. Showing up was more important than showing up perfectly prepared. The rental car GPS guided him through familiar suburban streets toward David's house. At 10:30 on a Wednesday night, most of the neighborhood was dark, but 1247 Maple Drive showed warm light in the kitchen windows. Through the sheer curtains, Richard could see David sitting alone at the kitchen table, laptop open, papers scattered around him. Richard sat in the driveway for 10 minutes, engine running, heater fighting the January cold. This was his last chance to change his mind, to drive back to the airport and maintain the status quo of mutual disappointment. But Michelle's words echoed in his mind. David had spent Christmas night crying. His son, his stubborn, successful, emotionally guarded son, had cried over their argument. The doorbell seemed to echo through the house like a gunshot. Richard heard footsteps, then silence as David presumably checked the peephole. More silence, then the sound of the deadbolt turning. David opened the door wearing pajama pants and a Northwestern University sweatshirt Richard had given him 15 years ago. His hair was disheveled, and his eyes showed the kind of exhaustion that comes from sleepless nights rather than long days. "Dad?" David's voice was neutral, carefully controlled. "Can we talk?" David stepped aside without a word, and Richard entered the house that felt both familiar and foreign. The Christmas tree was still up, though the presents beneath it had been cleared away. The living room showed signs of children. Sophie's coloring books on the coffee table, Jake's Nintendo Switch charging on the side table, Emma's reading glasses forgotten on the couch arm. "Michelle and the kids are at her sister's," David said, settling into his recliner. "I asked them to give us some space." Richard took the couch, the same spot where he'd sat during the Christmas disaster. The silence stretched between them, neither man knowing how to begin a conversation they'd been avoiding for decades. Finally, David spoke. "Lisa said you changed your will." "Yes, because of Christmas Eve." "Partly." Richard chose his words carefully. "But mostly because I realized I don't know how to be your father anymore, and you don't seem to know how to be my son." "Gertie." David's laugh was bitter. "So you decided to solve that by writing me out of your life legally?" "I decided to stop pretending our relationship was something it isn't." Richard leaned forward. "David, when was the last time you called me just to talk? Not about the grandchildren's birthdays or holiday plans or family logistics, but just to hear my voice." David opened his mouth to respond, then closed it. The silence was answer enough. "When was the last time I called you the same way?" Richard continued. "When was the last time we had a conversation that wasn't an obligation or a negotiation or a careful dance around things we're both thinking but not saying?" "I don't know," David admitted quietly. "Neither do I, and that's the problem." Richard settled back into the couch. "We've become strangers who share DNA and history, but not much else." David was quiet for several minutes, staring at his hands. When he finally looked up, his eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I don't know how to talk to you, Dad. I never have." The raw honesty in his son's voice broke something open in Richard's chest. "What do you mean?" "I mean you're brilliant and successful and always 10 steps ahead of everyone else, and I've spent my entire life trying to figure out how to impress you, or at least not disappoint you." The words came out in a rush, as if David had been holding them back for years. "And every conversation feels like a test. I'm probably failing." Richard stared at his son, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time in decades. This wasn't the confident, successful accountant who ran his own firm and raised 3 beautiful children. This was the little boy who used to bring his homework to Richard's home office, hoping for approval that often got postponed by business calls and urgent emails. "You think I'm disappointed in you?" "Aren't you?" David's voice cracked slightly. "I'm not you, Dad. I didn't build an empire. I run a small accounting firm in suburban Chicago. I drive a 7-year-old minivan and worry about college tuition and whether we can afford to refinish the basement. I'm exactly the kind of ordinary middle-class dad you probably swore you'd never be." The pain in David's voice was so raw, so unexpected, that Richard felt his own careful emotional control beginning to crumble. "David, I have never, not once, been disappointed in you." "Really?" Then why do you always sound surprised when I tell you about my life? Why do you always follow up my news with suggestions for how I could do things better or differently? Richard tried to remember their recent conversations, and with uncomfortable clarity, he realized David was right. When David mentioned a difficult client, Richard offered business strategy. When David talked about the kids' activities, Richard suggested better time management techniques. He'd thought he was being helpful, sharing decades of experience with his son. Instead, he'd been sending the message that David's choices weren't good enough. "I thought I was helping," Richard said quietly. "You were trying to fix me. There's a difference." They sat in silence again, but this time it felt different, less hostile, more sad. Richard looked around the living room, really seeing it for the first time. The family photos on the mantel, the children's artwork magneted to the refrigerator visible through the kitchen doorway, the comfortable furniture that prioritized function over style. This wasn't a house designed to impress anyone. It was a home designed for living. "I'm proud of you," Richard said suddenly. David looked up, startled. "I'm proud of the life you've built, the father you are, the husband you are. I'm proud that you chose substance over success, family over fortune." Richard's voice grew stronger as he continued. "I gave you and Lisa everything money could buy, but I never gave you what you really needed. My attention, my presence, my approval without conditions." David wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "Dad, let me finish." Richard stood up, pacing to the window that looked out onto the backyard, where an elaborate playset dominated the lawn. "I spent your childhood building financial security for our family's future, and I missed your childhood in the process. I thought providing was the same as parenting. I thought success would compensate for absence." He turned back to face his son. "And when your mother got sick, I realized too late that all the money in the world couldn't buy back the moments I'd missed. So I tried to change, tried to be more present, but by then you were an adult with your own life, and I didn't know how to bridge 20 years of emotional distance." David was crying openly now, the kind of raw, unguarded tears that men in their 30s rarely allow themselves. "I wanted to be close to you, Dad, but every time I tried, I felt like I was bothering you, interrupting something more important." "You were never an interruption," Richard said fiercely. "You and Lisa were the most important things in my life. I just didn't know how to show it, and I didn't know how to ask for it." Richard moved back to the couch, sitting closer to his son than they'd sat in years. "David, can I tell you something I've never told anyone?" David nodded, still wiping his eyes. "The night before your mother died, she made me promise to keep trying with you. She said you needed me more than you'd ever admit, and I needed you more than I'd ever admit, and we were both too stubborn to admit it." Richard's own voice was unsteady now. "She was right. I do need you. I need to know that 38 years of being your father meant something. I need to know that despite all my mistakes, you don't regret having me as a dad." "Dad, of course I don't regret it." David reached out hesitantly, then placed his hand on his father's arm. "You taught me about integrity, about work ethic, about taking care of family. You showed me what it means to build something lasting. I needed you to show me you loved me for who I am, not who I might become with the right guidance." They sat like that for several minutes, father and son, finally having the conversation they'd needed for decades. Outside, the January wind rattled the windows, but inside, something was thawing. "I owe you an apology," Richard said finally. "For Christmas Eve, but also for years of making you feel like you weren't enough, for missing games and recitals and moments that mattered to you, for prioritizing business over presence. I owe you an apology too, David replied. "For Christmas Eve especially. For asking why you were even there when the answer should have been obvious. Because you're my father and I love you, even when I'm too scared or proud to show it properly." "Are we going to be okay?" Richard asked, and was surprised by how young his own voice sounded. David smiled, the first genuine smile Richard had seen from him in years. "Yeah, Dad. I think we're going to be okay, but I need you to understand something." "What's that?" "I can't be the son you might have imagined. I'm never going to take over a business empire or move to Florida or become some version of you. I'm going to stay in suburban Chicago and coach Little League and worry about mortgage payments and be ordinary in all the ways that probably drive you crazy." Richard laughed, surprising them both. "David, I don't want you to be me. I want you to be the best version of yourself, and from what I can see, you already are." David stood up and walked to the kitchen, returning with 2 bottles of beer. "Want to stay up too late talking like we probably should have been doing for the past 20 years? Richard accepted the beer, noting it was the same brand he'd been drinking since David was in college, a small detail that suggested his son had been paying attention in ways Richard had never noticed. "I'd like that," Richard said, "but first I need to call Harold and restore your inheritance." David shook his head. "Keep it the way you changed it." What? "Dad, I don't need your money to know you love me. And honestly, Lisa deserves the bigger share. She's been the bridge between all of us for years, managing relationships I was too scared to handle myself." David took a long drink of his beer. "Give me enough for the kids' college funds, and let's call it even. David, it's $12 million. And you earned every penny of it. But what I want from you isn't money. It's Sunday phone calls and birthday visits and help with homework when you're in town. I want my kids to know their grandfather, not as the guy who sends expensive presents, but as the guy who shows up." Richard felt something settle in his chest, a peace he hadn't experienced since Margaret's death. "I can do that, but I'm still changing the will back. What you do with the money when I'm gone is your choice, but it's yours by right." They talked until 3 in the morning, covering ground they'd never explored before. David told Richard about his therapy sessions, his fears about fatherhood, his dreams of expanding the accounting firm into financial planning. Richard told David about the loneliness of widowhood, his regrets about missed opportunities, his pride in both his children that he'd never known how to express. As Richard prepared to leave, David walked him to the door. "Dad, next Christmas, don't bring presents. Just bring yourself, and call first, not because you're not welcome, but because we'll want to make sure we're all here when you arrive." Richard hugged his son, really hugged him, the way he should have been doing for years. "I love you, David. I'm sorry it took me so long to say it right. I love you too, Dad, and I'm sorry it took me so long to let you." Driving back to his hotel, Richard realized that for the first time in years, he was looking forward to the future. Not because his problems were solved. Rebuilding a relationship would take time and patience and continued effort from both of them. But because finally, he and David were working toward the same goal. The next morning, Richard called Harold and scheduled an appointment to restore David's inheritance. Then he called Lisa to tell her about the conversation, and she cried with relief. Then he called Michelle to thank her for her courage in reaching out. And then he called David just to hear his voice. "Hey, Dad." David answered on the second ring, and Richard could hear the smile in his voice. "Hey, son," Richard replied. "I was wondering if you'd like to grab lunch sometime next week. I'll be staying in Chicago for a while." "I'd like that," David said. "I'd like that very much." As Richard hung up the phone, he thought about Margaret's final request, that he keep trying, that he not let pride destroy their family. It had taken him almost losing David completely to understand what she meant, but finally he was keeping his promise. Outside his hotel window, Chicago stretched grey and cold under a January sky. But for the first time since Margaret's death, Richard Thompson felt like he was home. Epilogue. 6 months later, Richard moved back to Chicago, buying a small condo 15 minutes from David's house. He attended Jake's baseball games and Emma's piano recitals, and helped Sophie with her math homework. The inheritance remained as originally planned, but it no longer defined their relationship. On Christmas Eve, 1 year after the argument that nearly destroyed them, Richard sat in David's living room watching his grandchildren open presents. When Sophie asked if Grandpa was staying for Christmas dinner, David answered without hesitation, "Of course he is, sweetheart. He's family." And finally, Richard understood what Margaret had always known, that being family isn't about being perfect, it's about showing up, speaking truth, and choosing love even when it's complicated, especially when it's complicated.